Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. I'm Brooke Kroger. I'm the current director and very pleased to be here tonight for this celebration of the launch 9 days ago of the Local East Village, our new community blog that we are very, very happy to bring to the neighborhood and to have so many of you present to share this occasion with us. I'd also like to say a special welcome to Mrs. Javits. We're so delighted to have you with us this evening for this presentation by Pete and our party afterwards. I also have a special announcement tonight that I'm very pleased to be able to make. The Knight Foundation has told us this afternoon that they are providing a generous grant to this project to help us with its first 2 years, and this will really enable us to do many of the things we have planned to bring innovation and great in-depth reporting to this neighborhood, which is our goal, and to engage this community in the process in a pro-am fashion. That's what we're all about. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the editor of the localeastvillage.com. That's http://localeastvillage.com. Please visit soon and often. And it's Richard G. Jones.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out today. I just want to start out by acknowledging some of my colleagues, my current and former colleagues. My former colleagues from the New York Times are here. Mary Ann Giordano, who was my editor when I was in the Trenton Bureau in New Jersey in the State House, and I hope I'm as gentle and kind and capable an editor as she was for me. Jeremy Zeiler, the blog specialist at the New York Times, has been terrific. Brian Heyman and Catherine McElroy. Also, our faculty colleagues, too many of you here to name individually, but if you can just sort of raise your hands, I want to acknowledge all of you here. Thank you so much for being here also. And our fine students also, particularly those in the hyperlocal news class. If you want to stand up also, we want to acknowledge all of you, please. All right. They're out getting posts, which is good. I'm glad to see that they're all out reporting, which is good. So again, thank you all for coming here. I do appreciate it. You know, tonight is billed as a celebration for the local, and I really do sincerely appreciate you all turning out to support our blog. And when I say our blog, I mean that, very sincerely and very deeply. This is something that is all of ours. We should all feel a sense of ownership about this project. I think tonight also represents something more. It's a celebration, really, I think, of the spirit of journalistic collaboration that we're trying to promote with this project. We're all engaged in a wonderful venture here. And I hope that this is the beginning of the start of a really good and substantial conversation about ways that we can all work together at the same table as storytellers. And who better to really start that conversation for us tonight than Pete Hamill? Pete's long and illustrious career speaks for itself. He was beloved at the Daily News. He's beloved at the Post. He's beloved here, where he is a universally respected colleague and a wonderful mentor to our fine students. He's touched just about every base that you can touch in this town, and he's still in the game, very much so. He has a new book coming out on immigration. That'll be in ebook form only, so I encourage you all to look for that. We've all had the benefits of enjoying his gifts as a journalist and an essayist. We've enjoyed his fiction, and I'm very fond of telling my students, news is indeed a verb, right? So, without further ado, let the conversation begin. I'm very honored to present the Distinguished Writer-in-Residence at the New York University Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute and this year's University Jacob Javits Professor, Pete Hamill.
Thank you very much, Rich. My resume is now so long it reads like a Chinese restaurant menu. It goes on and on, so I love the tabloid essence that you gave it. Thank you. I particularly tonight want to talk to those of you who are young reporters about to set out on a marvelous project. Some of you already engaged in doing it. With any luck, it's the kind of project that will change many lives, including your own. The task, the challenge is enormous. To truly plunge into the many layers of the East Village, to try to pick apart the various things that make up the collage that's the East Village. And doing that, you educate yourself about history, about human beings, about the role of work, ambition, desire, a little bit of heartbreak too, and yes, joy in the present. That's what that neighborhood gave me when I moved to it in 1958 to 2nd Avenue and 9th Street. It was not called the East Village then. It was just the Lower East Side. Real estate guys have a genius for renaming neighborhoods. The neighborhood I grew up in Brooklyn is now called the South Slope, in great hopes that they can jack up the rents in tenements as if they were in brownstones. And I think they're succeeding somewhere, probably with NYU students. I was 23 when I moved to the East Village, but I'd already had something of a life. I had dropped out of high school when I was 16. I just got an honorary degree after 59 years, allowing me to call myself a graduate of that high school, which is a place called Regis up on 84th Street. The Jesuits are slow at this thing. And then I went into the Navy. I went to Mexico for a year on the GI Bill, the greatest piece of social legislation in my lifetime. I went to Pratt when I came back, and I had to make a living. So I began to work at as an artist assistant in an advertising agency, and moved into 307 East 9th Street. The building is still there. It's on the 3rd floor with my friend Jake Connerboy and Bill Powers, also two vets from Brooklyn. And next door at 309, where I also lived, we had the joys of a stoop. Stoops are very important, named by the Dutch, and not to be mixed up with a Yiddish word that's very similar to it, which I won't repeat in case, but we didn't stoop around. I had been to the neighborhood before I moved there, because I was a huge fan of Book Row on 4th Avenue that started at about 9th Street and went all the way to 13th Street, where all the secondhand bookstores were. The only remaining one is the Strand, which moved over to Broadway. But I knew the neighborhood sort of. I knew where Cooper Union was. I knew it was so long ago that actually the block where there's a huge skyscraper, almost semi-skyscraper on the corner where the Chase Bank is, was filled with Cuban cigar makers, rolling them while you watched. And they're long gone. But when I moved in, I had discovered something in Mexico that was very important to the way I adjusted to the East Village, and that was to get out of the house, that you had to go out and walk, that shoe leather was the process of knowing another place. It's the same, knowing the East Village, for those of you who want to be journalists, the same rules that apply that you would use if you went to Paris. You ask yourself, why is it here? You ask yourself, who owns it? asking those questions, even when you don't have the answers, lead you to ways of beginning to understand the place. In those days, too, right outside those windows right here, the Bowery still had the L. When I first came around, it was quite an amazing place. It looked like a lot of those paintings by Reginald Marsh that showed basically forlorn-looking white guys. And when you talked to them, there was always one reason for why they were there: a woman. They all had the same tale. I think the tales, as Eugene O'Neill and others who've explored the mentality of it would tell us later, it was the excuse. It wasn't what really happened, which was a great thing for a young guy interested in wanting to be a writer, to learn skepticism. And one of the great workshops for skepticism was the Bowery. Around the corner, and particularly on 2nd Avenue and 9th Street, there were a number of Ukrainians there. The most Ukrainians, I think, that ever assembled at one time in New York City were all in that neighborhood. On the corner was a little, very narrow coffee shop called Veselka. It's now 3 times the size it was then. There was a place called Stuyvesant Casino right off the corner where they played Dixieland as a kind of retro protest to bebop. And that's now Ukrainian Hall, as you know. Those of you who know the neighborhood. And across from McSorley's, the beginnings of a Ukrainian church were operating at the time. So I began to ask questions. Where the hell do Ukrainians come from? Was one of them, and learned about the Ukraine and where people and how they were able to get out, because we still had these stupid immigration laws that had quotas on certain countries based on a percentage in 1933 or something. And they were DPs, displaced persons, who were given a special situation inside the immigration law at the time. And they were wonderful people to talk to meet, to laugh with as they tried to learn English. And those of us who failed at learning Ukrainian found some common language that we could speak to about it. But there were other things in that particular street. Right down the block, I got to meet in 1960 a wonderful writer named Edward Hoagland, who had just published a piece in Esquire called The Last Irish Fighter that was really terrific, and was part of a novel that he wrote called The Circle Home, one of the best books about boxing ever. And I became friends with him. He had a terrible stammer, which he has written about, which made him as a writer an observer and a listener. 2 of the great things that anybody who wants to be either a reporter or a fully sentient human being should develop: to be able to see, not just look, and to listen. And so his books, his novels in particular, were full of dialogue that sounded as authentic as if it were recorded on a tape recorder. He was a wonderful writer and a very generous friend to me and some other guys on 9th Street. Around the corner, on St. Mark's Place, 1 block over, I used to go to a place called the 5 Spot. There was no minimum, so you could put $1 on the bar and sit there and listen to Thelonious Monk for an hour. He was there so often that he sounded like the house band. And for those of you who have never seen Thelonious Monk, it was a show. He hit some of the deepest chords with his forearm of any musician I ever heard in my life. But right up the block a bit number 77, I think it was, lived W.H. Auden. And Auden lived in a house that I think Trotsky might have lived in at one point. It was certainly a Trotskyite neighborhood. And Auden, you would see him shuffling in the street, heading usually towards 4th Avenue or down 8th Street to go over probably the 8th Street bookstore somewhere. I never had the guts to go up and say, Mr. Auden, I love your work, blah, blah, blah. I didn't want to do that. But to see a great poet alive, actually working, walking on 8th Street and probably working too as words bounced around his skull, was an experience for a young guy that I cherish to this day. And one summer, I think it was 62, I began hearing somebody playing guitar up in the street, up in the house across the way from where we lived, with the windows open, because nobody had air conditioning on that block that I know of. And I asked about him, and I said, who's this guitar player? He says, his name, one of the guys told me, his name is Jimmy something, and he's left-handed. He seemed much more astonished by the left-handed guitar player than by what he was playing. And what he was playing sounded beautiful walking out in the street in the afternoon. And that was Jimi Hendrix. By the time I realized who Jimi Hendrix was, he was long gone from 9th Street, but he's paid his rent there too. I mention these places not to drop names, but to say that the East Village, which had iron workers living in it, which had some bad guys in it, which had probably the scattered remnants from coming up from the Bowery, also had some people of uncommon quality who added to that collage. They gave the place a richness, a sense of being lived in a way that had nothing to do with showing your friends how rich you were, for sure, and had certainly the advantage of people actually talking to each other in the streets. Because television had really taken over by then. In certain neighborhoods, you never saw people anymore. They were upstairs, watching before these things even. You would see the blue light in the windows from the television sets, certainly in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And there were many more people out in the street where I lived down there. I got to know it bit by bit by wandering around. And also by having friends who pointed the way to me. For example, I knew very quickly that I couldn't understand this neighborhood without understanding the Yiddish theater. There was no way to do that. I mean, the old theaters were still there. There were a couple of what they called appetizing stores still there. Occasionally there would be a revival starring Menashe Skulnik or Molly Picon, but basically it was gone because there were no replenishments for obviously horrific reasons to the Yiddish-speaking population of that neighborhood. But I began to notice a UJA truck that would come around once a week and asked them what that was about, and it was for these isolated women still living in the tenements up and down those streets. Jewish women. The kids had either grown up and moved to Florida and California and other places. They didn't want to follow. You had to learn how to drive to go to California. And they stayed there, and the UJA truck would come around and bring food. And I went with them a couple of times, helping carry the stuff up the stairs. And these old, tough old ladies. They were all about this big. I mean, they're just like the old ladies the same size in Florida, the so-called headless drivers, you know, who got in the car and they were like this, and backed out of driveways doing 65 miles an hour, you know. And they were tough. They talked sometimes as if the Triangle Fire had happened 3 weeks earlier, and not in 1911. They could read Yiddish. Their language was the English was sprinkled with Yiddish. And they were in a neighborhood that had changed while they stayed. And the rapidity of change, which is one of the things common to so many parts of New York, had made them nostalgic even for the Depression, for hard times, for the times when everybody was together and there was a rich, deep life in the street. They were also some of the crankiest women I ever met in my life, even while they were examining the food these poor UJA guys were carrying out, you know. But the Yiddish theater was the thing that sparked my memory. I remember so clearly in 1962, after I'd become a newspaper man, my editor, Paul Sand, coming up and dropping a collected volume of the short stories of Sholem Aleichem on my desk and saying, "Read this, your tribe's in it too." And I didn't even know who Sholem Aleichem was at the time, and I began to read him, and there was my tribe. Tevye the dairyman was Murphy the milkman. There were similarities between the shtetls that Sholem Aleichem wrote about and the hamlets, the individual neighborhoods of New York City, very similar. And I began to read about Sholem Aleichem, and he had come actually to try his hand at writing for the Yiddish theater here. He had some failures there and left. But reading parts of the history, how I wished I could have known him. I wanted to go with him to see the Yiddish language version of King Lear, which had a happy ending, you know. And I just wanted to be there to see that. And although it's easy as we laugh about the happy ending to King Lear, the audience and the producers knew this. The audience was full of people who got here to this town and to this neighborhood because they believed in happy endings. They got here, and they had happy endings for their kids. Later on, the kids didn't operate push carts. The kids were going to City College. The kids were going into the Army and fighting for this country, dying for it sometimes. The kids had the GI Bill. The kids went on to become professionals and teachers and to honor this city in a way that even the parents couldn't have imagined. But there were some bad guys around. There were Jewish bad guys. There were Irish bad guys. Rocky Graziano, the great middleweight champion, in his autobiography, had a sentence that I think summed it up. He was talking about growing up on 10th Street and Avenue A. He said, "In my neighborhood, we only robbed things that started with an A. A car, a house, a store." And Rocky, in that book, same book, talks about the night. There was a fable that in St. Mark's in the Bowery, the remains of Peter Stuyvesant were down there with his silver leg. And everybody, every once in a while, will climb over the fence and try to dig up Peter Stuyvesant's bones and take the silver leg off somewhere, probably on the Bowery, and pawn it. Rocky and his friends were among the people who did raids every once in a while and went over there, and they dug and they dug and they dug, and they never found the silver thing. And he says, "I never went near the place later." I asked him about it when I interviewed him one time later. So there were bad guys. You can't romanticize it. There were bad guys who preyed on the same people who were doing all the work. Jews who preyed on Jews, Italians are preying on Italians. The Irish certainly had their crowd too. But what came out of the place, you read all the literature about it, was a toughness that was not the same as hardness. Right across 2nd Avenue from where we lived, across from Veselka, is a building that's still there, at the Ottendorfer Library. It was built by a rich German in 1885, I think it was, 86. The building next to it was a medical dispensary called the German Hospital, I think, and it had to change its name when World War I came, and everybody was ranting about the dirty, rotten Bosch and banning Mozart and Beethoven from Carnegie Hall and things like that. But it was the same. It came from the same root. And it was there, and it's there now. I mean, there's sign, you walk in, there's all computers everywhere. There's also signs offering a familiar service. English lessons for people who don't speak English. The kind of thing that Tammany Hall used to provide and others would provide in this town that changed it, that let us handle great immigrant tides, including the one here. That was changing when I was there already. There were parts of the neighborhood were growing Latino, mainly Puerto Ricans, who was the great wave of the Puerto Ricans, the first immigrant group to come by airplane. And they were moving in, and I heard Spanish everywhere, and I could talk to them, and because even though my Spanish was very original, that I had learned in Mexico, muy original, carajo, I was able to talk to them, and they were no different from the Ukrainians and other immigrants, those cranky old ladies, and what they wanted in that neighborhood. They wanted to work above all, they wanted to get paid, and they wanted their kids to be, one, taller, which they were starting about 10, and to get the educations they couldn't get back where they came from. And that's still, to me, part of the heartbeat of the East Village, no matter how much it's changed and how gentrified parts of it have become. I also later, as a reporter, began to see in the same streets the thing that wrecked so many neighborhoods in this town, the nexus of guns and heroin. When the heroin came, people started locking their doors. They didn't lock their doors. You could walk into a tenement right on Tompkins Square, walk up to the 4th floor, never see a locked door. That became one of the great killers of ambition, certainly of joy. So many people got hurt by the heroin in particular, and later, 25 years later, by crack cocaine too, which was in some ways even worse than heroin, because heroin the junkies would nod off. The crack dopes would want more. It was like, give me everything, give me more, at the expense of people who worked for a living, the expense of delivery boys delivering food, at the expense of people trying to walk their children in the park. It was a terrible particular time. But for me, it was like a great learning experience. My own neighborhood was a mixture of Irish, Italians, and Jews, working class Jews, small shopkeepers, taxi drivers. When I got to the Lower East Side, in addition to the artists, I began to see the young children of them One of them had been a friend of mine in the Navy, and Nick Oakland, and I used to visit his father's store on East Fifth Street. The father had had his jaw broken by the Nazis before he made it out and got here. And we would talk and hear, and he would bemoan the fact that his son, Nick, my friend, had moved to Denver, which to him was some unimaginable place on the other side of the world. On 9th Street, too, we had some other people. We had a guy named Mike the Maniac who ran an auto parts place. I don't know where the cars came from. They probably belonged to people in Jersey or something. But he spent a lot of time filing things off the inside of the place and screaming and hollering. He was wonderful. We would just go down. Let's go down and listen to Mike. And Mike would be yelling. But also around the corner on 10th Street, where St. Mark's is, my friend Joel Oppenheimer was a poet in residence and working for The Voice and doing all kinds of wonderful things for other people. You could walk along 10th Street because my other friend, Seymour Krim, Cy Krim, a wonderful, generous critic who knew the art of celebration. He could celebrate a writer. He was a counsel for the defense, not a prosecutor. And he did amazing, wonderful work. Those of you who don't know him, one of his books is called Views of a Nearsighted Cannoneer, worth looking at still now. But also you could see on that street living there, Willem de Kooning lived there for a while. Harold Rosenberg, one of the great critics who brought the action painters into existence after the war, lived there. And they lived there a couple of blocks from where Rocky Graziano was only robbing things with an A. That began with an A. It was possible to have overlapping worlds. And it was a great lesson to somebody starting out as a reporter to understand that the world is not a cartoon. The world is not a sociological study. The world is full of people one at a time. And those of you who are journalists must understand that. You're the people that can get in and put a face on what's happening in a place. I started in the newspaper business in another very weird way. I was an art director. I became an art director through sheer chance of a Greek magazine called Atlantis. I didn't read a word of Greek. The editor, the son of the owner, didn't read a word of Greek, a wonderful fellow named Jim Blasto, who later worked in local politics for many years. And one day we were talking about the fact that neither one of us could read this magazine that we were helping to put out every month. And he said, why don't we put one article a month in English? I said, that's great. Who would write it? He said, why don't you write something? I said, he knew I liked writing and reading. And he said, no, give it a try. I said, well, who should I write about? What? And he said, who would you write about if you read? I said, well, I like this fighter, Jose Torres. And Jose, at the time, I knew him very slightly from the Gramercy Gym up on 14th Street at Irving Place. He had just started fighting. He was knocking out everybody, and I liked him, the little I knew of him. So I said, oh, let me try. So I did a piece. I wrote this piece about how I went to see him and interviewed him and sat him down and talked and wrote the piece. The magazine came out. I showed up at the magazine one day, and Jimmy says, the old man wants to see us. And I said, okay. We went upstairs to his wood-paneled office. It was right next to the High Line on 23rd Street. We sat down, and he said, "Why is, in a Greek magazine, a story about a Puerto Rican guy written by an Irish guy in English?" And Jimmy saved my career with, after one beat, he said, "Dad, the young Greeks love him." He knew that his father didn't know a single young Greek. And he says, "Okay, next time you do anything like this, make it about a Greek." So I wrote about Melina Mercouri a couple of months later, because she was just starting out. That helped me, in a way, to get to work at the New York Post, because I was reading, finally, as a writer, reading the paper and trying to understand how these people wrote these stories. What was in them? What was this about? I was still working as an art director, still using rubber cement and pasting stuff and all that. But the newspapers consumed me. And I finally, Jimmy Wexler sent me a note and said, "Why don't you come down and talk someday?" And then he said, "I think maybe I can," and I did, and he said, "I think maybe I can arrange a tryout for you," in 1960. And he gave me the tryout, June 1st, 1960, and changed my life. I was still living on 9th Street and 2nd Avenue, and moved finally down into 309, one flight up the stoop, where the bathtub was in the kitchen with a big ceramic top on it that you lifted up and then dove into. It was not bad. I don't know, now it's probably $1,300 a month to get in. Yeah. Well, I had 2 rooms, a bedroom and no kitchen, just the top of the... What I was driving at, though, and what I think all of you who are not familiar with the East Village and want to learn about it, and particularly those engaged on the making of this amazing new project here with the Times, is that every place is what, in the fanciest way, is often called a palimpsest. That was a kind of writing on a tablet or sometimes a piece of wood with wax used, where it hadn't been totally erased. And you go, so you keep writing on it. There are many pieces of old writing down on that neighborhood, enough to supply you with material for the rest of your life if you wanted to dig into them. And at the same time, it's full of people who are still making marks, fresh marks, in the present. So it's not about being hooked on any so-called golden age. There was no golden age. There were different ages. Some things lasted seemingly forever. The Gem Spa has outlasted Ratner's. Who would have bet money on that? Who would have bet money that people still come in taxi cabs looking for egg creams, not knowing what they are? They've read about it in some guidebooks, and they're asking for egg cream, please. But it did, those places did teach us a lot about me, my friends who lived there, our other friends, Ted Hoagland, and I'm sure Auden himself, that there are many ways to be a New Yorker. And that area permitted almost all of them. There's places that you can learn about it. I love the Tenement Museum on Orchard Street in Delancey. It has the best bookstore of New York books in the city. Those of you working on New York projects, it's a great place to start. In addition to looking at what some of those tenements looked like on the east side not that long ago. The Museum of the City of New York has amazing stuff. The New York Historical Society has unbelievable things. What I found writing about the past most useful in certain research are the bound volumes of the newspapers themselves, because it's not simply the news stories that you're looking at. The advertising teaches you something. How much did a suit cost in 1934? How much did it cost to get into Lowe's State? How many people went to the Polo Grounds in the middle of a depression to watch baseball, and how much did they pay? That kind of information is there in the bound volumes that the public library often has, and I think the Bobst has a pretty good collection of them too. Certainly people are doing research this day into the bound volumes of the Daily Forward, for the Forwards, as they all call it. In fact, retrieving stories by people as famous as Isaac Bashevis Singer and many others who wrote for it as a newspaper. What they're doing now down there could be one of the places, what they're publishing now down there in the way of newspapers could be one of the projects to figure out, to go in a neighborhood and look at the newsstand and see if there's anything on the newsstand except the Daily News, the Post, and the Times. There might be other things that are telling you about changes that can indicate how you can go and ask the right questions. Where I live down below Canal Street, the newsstands have Chinese papers. They have a Diario de Mexico, a daily paper, just Mexican news. They have El Diario too. They still tell you something about the composition of the neighborhood. So anything you do that way will help you. But I also think you have to trust your own eyes and ears and to use all your senses when you're moving through a place. Years ago in the 60s, I was in London, and one of my editors took me to meet the great V.S. Pritchett, Victor Pritchett, who was a wonderful literary reviewer, great travel writer, has a wonderful book on New York, and wrote spectacular short stories. And I asked him when we relaxed a little, how did he know so much? Because you read the short stories and they were full of the detail of the lives of the characters. And he couldn't possibly have had all those jobs. He couldn't have worked in a pawn shop. He said, I walk around, I see a place I've passed and hadn't really scrutinized. I stand in a doorway and I watch. That was all. That's how he learned, to see what the rhythm of a day was, to see whether the morning is a different kind of traffic than the afternoon, to go in and talk to people, and above all, if you're a writer, to listen to people. You're not there to perform your life. You're trying to find out about the other life. I've also found, and I think, again, for you young reporters, women are much better storytellers than men. Men are so full of the macho nonsense that they want to talk to you about the Cowboys game or the Jets or something like that, a substitute for conversation. And what they dismiss as gossip on the part of women is the stuff of great literature. Have you heard about what Madame Bovary is up to? You know, that kind of, it's the stuff. Did you know that dope Don Quixote rode off with a lance heading towards a windmill? You know, that kind of gossip is the beginning of literature. And I think listening is so crucial to writing. in addition to the other senses. I think one of the things writers, as compared to photographers and videographers, can convey that they can't is smell. What is the aroma of something? What is the odor in a hallway? Is it like a backed up sewer? What food are you smelling, cooking from floor to floor? What music do you hear at the same time? Are you hearing Ruben Blades on the second floor and Tchaikovsky on the top floor? That's an interesting place to live. Being open, fully sentient, is so crucial to being alive. Not just to be a writer, but to be a consumer of writing. The great fiction teaches everybody how to be more fully alive, whether they want to be writers or not. Doesn't matter. And the Lower East Side, when I was there, the East Village, was a place that forced you to pay attention like that, because so much of it was still lived on the street. The other thing to do for the young is assume nothing. Don't leave the office or your house or the computer thinking you know what the story is. You have a rough idea. There's a murder on 2nd Avenue and 10th Street. You go there to find out about it or to cover it and discover it's a lot more complicated than you thought, and certainly more complicated than an editor can know back at headquarters at a place. Working on blogs is a way to learn craft, but unless you have people editing there who are saying things like, where did you get this? You're not going to learn much. You know, you have to have a verifiable story once you unravel what the initial bad news was all about. Television is getting so sloppy, you know, you'll see a car chase, and as soon as we know what this is about, we'll get back to you, you know. Or you get television reporters saying, this is indescribable. And you say, schmuck, your job is to describe it. But because of the intimacy of the East Village, and it's still intimate, you know, there's some high buildings going up, there's still changes that are, you know, unsettling to people who knew it when you could actually see the sky. It still has an intimate feeling to me when I move through the streets. It's not people I know anymore, but they're people, and everybody's got a story if you're patient, if you listen. If you decide that the way people live is of interest to others, and I think it is, that there's things to also watch. You look and say, what's the graffiti saying? Are there any verbs in the graffiti, or is it just Dumbo or somebody's name? Does nobody love anybody else? Is there no Juan loves Rosie? You never see that graffiti anymore. I don't. I just see names, a kind of exercise in painted narcissism. But there's no verbs. Looking at the graffiti as a reporter and as a non-reporter, just interested in being alive to what's around you, you see if there are repeated names. Are there contests going on? My tag is better than your tag. What's going on, if you can figure it out? Whether it's worth knowing is another question. And just because it's there doesn't mean that it's art. It has to have some value beyond that. If you're wandering around a neighborhood like that now, you should be looking to see if there are any political clubs left. I'm convinced that one reason for the immigration mess we have now is there's no equivalent anymore of the Democratic Tammany Hall style old-fashioned political club where people could walk in, be helped through the writing of the papers. You'd see Louise down the corner there. She'll help you fill them out and get you on your way to becoming a citizen and getting a job. There's nothing like that I know of anymore. All the money is consumed by television commercials instead of doing what a really grassroots kind of political club would do. And I could be mistaken, but I don't see them when I wander the East Village anymore, and it's worth finding out what has replaced them, if anything. I think there's things happening out of churches that are worth looking at, including the saving of churches like St. Bridget's. St. Bridget's was one of the great churches of the Irish famine generation of the Irish, and was saved in part by a Puerto Rican guy, which means everything changes and nothing changes. That the reason the Irish were there was they didn't have the money to live elsewhere. And some people didn't forget where they came from and helped save that place. If you're looking for subject matter, read the history and find out, for example, where did Allen Ginsberg live with Peter Orlovsky? Go there and find out who lives there now. That's not so hard. You don't have to break a door down to do that. You could leave a note. And talk to cops. Reporters sometimes have stereotypical visions of cops, but in my experience, cops do know a lot about what's going on. And I don't mean just in terms of criminality. Although anybody who wants to know better about cop procedures and how they work should look at Detective Story, which was a wonderful play, and then a pretty good movie with Kirk Douglas, and see what being a cop can do to people. Or read the Ed Mcbaine novels, which are the best novels about the way cops think and work in a city like New York, written by a New Yorker named Evan Hunter, under the name Ed Mcbaine. He wrote a huge number of those books, and it's almost like a Balzacian kind of guide to what the city was like across almost 50 years, starting from the first ones. When you're talking to people, those of you who want to make this your work, the golden rule always works. Treat people the way you'd like to be treated. Don't go knocking on a door and telling some woman her son just got his head blown off without really thinking about it, because you don't know sometimes whether she knows. You got to be very careful. You can't be rude. You can't treat them as if they have an obligation to talk to you, which they don't. But I think if you talk to them, not in terms of murder stories, but about almost anything, my experience was that if you talk in a normal tone of voice, start with the things they do. People love talking about what they do. If it's a carpenter, ask him how he knows a piece of wood is good. Ask him how he gets a perfect right angle. Ask him that kind of question. You could move on to, does he believe in God? What does he dream about at night? You'll get there eventually. But if you start with what he or she does, and that's the thing most people love to be able to talk about, whether they're a left fielder or a computer wizard. Get them going that way. One other thing to the young, take it from a survivor. Drinking or drugs don't help you become a better reporter. They don't help you become a better human being either. In particular, when you're working as somebody trying to be that sentient person I was talking about earlier, anything that blurs your vision and blurs memory. Had a wonderful time last night. I don't remember where, but you don't want to have that kind of moment because it's not. And remember one second great truth about New York City. Nothing good ever happens at 10 after 2 in the morning. Never. Never. I am convinced that Cain whacked Abel at 10 after 2 in the morning, probably over a woman. And if you're going out to find out what's up around the neighborhood at 10 after 2 without a friend or without a goal, go to bed, go to sleep, read Madame Bovary, read Don Quixote, read Machado de Assis. Another golden rule is never hurt anybody who can't hurt you back. When you go to places like the East Village, you're going to meet a lot of people who are vulnerable. Your purpose is not to con them into saying something that could damage them with their families or neighbors or other people they might know. So be careful. You can say anything you want about the president. He's got the Strategic Air Command, but the guy on 9th Street and Avenue B, he doesn't have that, so be careful that way. I think also to remember is a lesson that I learned long ago as a young boy that has helped me a lot as a newspaperman. My brother Tommy and I, who's 2 years younger than I am, were great fans of going from Brooklyn in the subway to see the ruins of the Normandy, which was a luxury liner that burned at the pier in 1942 at the beginning of the war. And my mother was someone who specialized in excursions that didn't cost money. So she would take us on the subway and walk us from the subway at Times Square over to the North River, to the Hudson River docks to look at the Normandy. And we were doing that one day when in the corner up against the wall there was a guy with a cup, a regular cup, not a paper cup, begging. Probably Irish. He looked like half the people my father knew. And we started joking, my brother and I, about this wino, as the guys were called then, both there and down the block here on the Bowery. My mother lost it. She got the both of us in front of her and said, "Don't you ever look down on anybody unless you're giving them a hand to get up." And took us off to see the Normandy. And that line, which I'm sure was not unique to her, that was uttered in the East Village by tough Jewish mothers who were not going to have their kids do what some people had done to them, by Italian mothers, by German mothers, by Polish mothers, by Ukrainian mothers. Some version of that was in the air and in what I learned again in the East Village. And when I became a newspaperman, I could never get it out of my head, because doing this craft, practicing it as best you can, even when it's imperfect, you can help people get up. You can help them get up. And I think that's what all of us should be for. And God help us, people are still doing it out here. In spite of everything, there are people out there tonight helping strangers get up. So I hope those of you who want to be journalists do that for the rest of your life. You'll have a nice, good, long life. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Excuse me for being windy, but if you have questions, please fire away. Yes, sir.
I was hoping you might say something about my old friend John Wilcock at the Village Voice.
Oh, he was great. Yeah.
The Underground Press.
Yeah.
Is that a possibility?
Well, I didn't know him that well. I knew him, though. Every time I got fired, I worked at the Village Voice, for a while. It was like, you know.
Fired from the Village Voice.
Yeah.
You remember why you got fired?
I can't remember now.
You used a very dirty word in the Village Voice.
What, Nixon? Oh, pot.
And that's why the Underground Press.
For those of you who don't know him, he was one of the founders of The Voice with Norman Mailer, Dan Wolfe, Ed Thatcher, and Norman Mailer. Mailer wrote a column for The Voice. And John also, he wrote some very good travel books, you know, at the same time. I liked them a lot, but we were not real close, but we knew each other. We'd bump into each other in the street, lather away for 11 minutes, and then keep moving, as people do. He was a good guy, though. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. How do you get brave as a reporter? I mean, you don't. How do you get brave as a reporter? How do you work up the nerve to talk to somebody and say, tell me about your life, you know, or whatever the question might be. And the way I dealt with it, because I had some bad experiences the first couple of years of what I alluded to earlier, calling someone up at 2 o'clock in the morning whose kid had just been killed or something. And I developed some techniques, you know, hello, have you heard the news? Something like that, and see how she responded. It was usually a woman answering the phone. But in terms of the courage, I began to think more about true courage. Those women that raised those kids had more courage than it takes for me to ask a question. And I would, to give myself a sense of perspective, I would say, there's 1 billion people in China. They don't care whether I botch this or not. You know, to say I am not the only person in the universe for this 2.5 minutes. And that gives you a sense of perspective. I think if you're determined to go in and treat people decently when you're meeting them, even if they're scoundrels, you know, in a place like where I grew up, the unforgivable sin was self-pity. There were exceptions. Murder was an unforgivable sin, and cruelty, all forms of cruelty. But the worst of the common sins, the dailiness of sin, and I say that without being much of a believer, was self-pity. So if you can talk to people with respect and decency, then they're the ones who are going to behave badly. If they do, you make notes. If they want to talk to you and respect any kind of deal that you make, if they say off the record, whether it's a poor person or a cop, you keep it off the record. You can't then go betray them the next day, or they'll never talk to you again. The cops particularly, the word will get out. But keep the word, whatever word you might give them, for a larger good, that you're going to get a richer sense of the story. Once you get somebody's confidence, you say, okay, who is the best friend of this guy? Did he have a girlfriend? Did he have, you begin to ask further questions that can lead to a richer, rounder story. But if you start out rude, as if you have, you're entitled to ask questions or you're going to lock them up, you're not going to get anything. Thank you. One more. Thank you all very much. I'd also like to thank Marion Javis for all she's done for this program, for NYU, and to make this possible. Thank you, Marion, again.
So thank you, Pete. I appreciate that. We all appreciate those words. We're going to have some food and some drink. We hope you'll stick around for that. But first, we're going to have a raffle for a Kindle. Kate, you want to come on up and do that? I also want to acknowledge three other individuals. Jim Schachter at the New York Times, who played a crucial role in this collaboration. I also want to acknowledge the faculty of the hyperlocal news class, Yvonne Laddie. You want to stand up? And Mary Quigley and Dara Werlin. And also, if you're interested in contributing, if you want to contribute to the site, you can reach out to Kim Davis, our community editor. Please, he'll be happy to talk to you. We want to have all of your contributions, all of your energy for the site. So, Kate? Oh, and absolutely, Kate Paniska and Andrew for organizing the party. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Oh, look. Is Annette Cohen here? Oh, congratulations.
Thank you all. Please stick around for some food and some drink, and Jen Pelly is going to entertain us with some music. So thank you so much.